final. Failure is never fatal. It's courage that counts. John Wooden. Welcome to the Guyana Dialogue. I'm your hostess, Shamiza Ali, and it's truly a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Tonight's topic is the fascinating story of how Mr. Hari Prashad created an urban village in Georgetown. The Guyana Dialogue is being sponsored by a coordinating council of Guyanese based in the US, UK, Canada, Guyana, and the Caribbean. Funding support is by well known philanthropist Dave Narayan from Dave West Indian Imports. Please welcome my moderator for tonight, Dr. Ganga Ramdas.
Thank you, Ms. Jamisa. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Our panelist is Professor Narayan Prasad. And our guest tonight is former political science professor, Dr. Baytoram Ramharack. Good evening. Welcome, everyone.
Good evening.
Dr. Ramdas, please go ahead.
Thank you, our host, Ms. Shamisa Ali. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers. Please like and share this important presentation on entrepreneurship. We have in our program today our main guest, Dr. Baytoram Ramharack, and our panelist, Professor Emeritus Narayan Prasad, whose career took him to FAMU, Florida Agricultural and Mechanical Universities. I am substituting for our regular moderator, Dr. Tara Singh. Dr. Baytoram Ramharack possesses a distinguished academic background, having earned a doctoral and master's degrees in political science and history from the esteemed uh, CUNY University, New York City College and University. His thirst for knowledge impelled him to conduct legacy research on Guyana that will benefit the diaspora and the international community. In doing so, he has demonstrated his unwavering commitment to intellectual exploration. Dr. Rambarack's scholarly pursuits have yielded 6 heritage publications, including a powerful Indian voice, Alice Bhagwande Singh, Reflections on Her Work in Guyana. Dr. Ramharack's signature publication comes at a time when self-starters are needed to create opportunities for survival and success in today's world. Hopefully, this publication will be an inspiration to students in all our schools and universities. Builders are needed everywhere. One Doti built a village in Guyana, the story of Hari Prashad and Prashad Nagar. This work is so important that it will shine light for those who are starting out on a path of wealth creation with little or no money. We shall learn from Dr. Ramharack about the landmark accomplishment from the distinguished East Indian immigrant Hari Prashad. Dr. Ramarak.
Well, good evening. Salam alaikum, namaskar. I think Ganga, you've kind of. I don't know if I deserve all of those accolades, but thank you from the bottom of my heart. And one of the things I should say is, for me, history is important, right? I've always asked myself. I mean, I've read about people like Jung Bahadur Singh and so on. But the thing is, growing up in Borvis, Guyana, it's very difficult to find more information about these folks. And as you get older, you learn that much of our history has been documented by the Europeans. Um, and I think it's important for us to be able to be part of that process, because we have to document our own history. And I think I've embarked on that path. And I've done some of the work that you've mentioned. There's some projects that I'm working on, which in my head, I know it's important for us to do. And one of those include the an examination on the ships. Guyana is the only place where two ships, carrying girmitias, which is the term I use to describe Indian immigrants, uh, landed on the same day, right? There would be, I think it was 112 days. You're looking at 3+ months. So my question is, what actually happened on those ships? We don't have a lot of information. We have bits and pieces of information. We have a diary from a doctor, for instance, um, Richmond, who wrote the diary. And we have some other research that were done, but we don't know exactly. That's like a black hole. We know what happened in India before. We know what happened in Guyana after indentureship. Uh, but that always intrigued me about that story about what happened on that voyage. So having said that, I'm glad you have me here today to talk about a famous person who's more of a contemporary um, person, Hari Prashad, who, as most people would know, was the entrepreneur who actually established this village called Prashad Nagar. I think in your advertisement, the word um, urban village was used, and I think that's more. It didn't cross my mind, but that to me is a more appropriate word to describe this village. And so there's really two stories about this work I've done on Hari Prashad. One is, and hopefully we can get into, and I'm going to stop here. The one story has to do with his life, right? A Girmitia, descendant of indentured laborer. So there's a remarkable story about what he has done. And of course, the other story has to do with this urban village, which we call Prashad Nagar. And for people who don't know, it's that little village that's sandwiched between, Bel Air on top on the south. You have Lamaha Gardens, and on the east, there's Sophia and Campbellville on the other side, on the western side.
Uh, doc- Dr. Narayan, uh, can you make your comments and ask questions? Hello?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes, we
Okay.
can.
Um, first, I want to commend you, Dr. Ramarak, because in the annals of Indian history in Guyana is very limited, and the bits and pieces that we can gather either come from Nat's History of Guyana or from Walter Rodney's The Working Class in America, in Guyana. I'm sorry, um, but as a child, I remember selling calendars with um, Singh's picture on it. He was the president of the Dharam Sabha, and I didn't know who Jang Bahadur Singh was as a child. All I could recall is that I had 100 calendar to sell, and they would go in a heartbeat. And so I commend you for going back into the archives to research these folks, because I think they have a tremendous impact on the psyche of Guyanese. Similarly, Hari Prashad had an impact on the psyche of Guyanese, not only with his founding of Prashad Nagar, but that the time he took to outline the streets and the names of the street, like Shanti Nikitan, Amla Avenue, Bisesar Road, it gives you some form of indigenousness with the scheme. Even though the scheme was kind of at that time middle class, Guyana, because many of the people who I knew from there were either teachers. I knew the superintendent of police who lived there and other professionals. But it was an indication of what can be achieved by a single individual within the Guyanese context. Now, can you elaborate on how that was possible?
Well, just again, so as you said, there's some famous people from Prashad Nagar, and people may know some of the names. One of them, obviously, person who lived there currently is Vindhya Prasad, or current minister, who was helpful in allowing me to use some of the pictures from the Horizon magazine. Um, uh, uh, Chandra Bali was from there. You had Pat Dial from there. Vincent Tika lived in, Prashad Nagar. Um, you have there's a fellow who was a famous writer, George Walcott. People may know the name, who lived there,
Mhm.
and obviously uh, Prem Prasad, who was our justice, who lived there.
Mhm. Yes.
Right. So it's a
Mhm.
famous area. A lot of famous people came from there, but I think you're asking me about Hari, so let me just say a few things about Hari Prashad. And um, I see, again, this is a person I've never heard of in my life growing up in Guyana, right? I heard about Jung Bahadur because I read about him in Chetty's biography, where he and his father went to meet him. And Jung said to Chetty's father, send the boy abroad to study. But then you start to dig, and you discover that there's a whole wealth of information about these folks. So Hari Prashad had actually written an autobiography, right? It's, I guess it's unknown, not known to a lot of people. So what I did was I reproduced that autobiography in this study that I did on him, but I've added four chapters to give the background to who he was and what his legacy means. So, very briefly, who was Hari Prashad? Um, this is a person who a lot of us can connect with, right? He started out as a tailor, right? Well, first to begin, let me tell you about his family. He lived in Plantation, Luzignan, but he grew up in Mahaika village, right? He was born um, in 1898. He passed away in 1987. So that would, if my math is correct, that would have make him 89 years old, right? His mother came from India's, I guess, the third popular state, Bihar. His mother's name was Etwaria, because we did the background, ancestral search on him. His father, Santram, came from UP, and I'm sure people are familiar with UP, which is India's popular state. Most of us, our ancestors, came from there. It's a state where Amitabh Bachchan grew up, Ravi Shankar um, and Maharishi Valmiki, who
Yes.
wrote in Sanskrit, these were mine. So it's a very popular story, But so Hari grew up in Lusignan. I'm sorry, as a kid, but he lived in Mahaika village, and he, developed these entrepreneurial skill because he was motivated. I do have to say that one of the driving motivation in him was at a very young age, he learned about some important concept that has to do with his culture. I'm talking about, being a Hindu. He learned
Mhm.
about Shraddha. He learned about the power of faith. He learned about dharma, duty, and karma, right?
Mhm.
Things you do in life, if it's good things, then it will benefit you in the long run. So he, at an early age, learned to speak Hindi, and he began to read. And he says this in his autobiography. This is not my word. Um, the Ramayana um, and the Bhagavad Gita. So those two books were very important for him. And from his parents, he learned about hard work. So he started out wanted to impress his father. He was initially, his first business was a tailor. He was trained, how to cut the cloth, how to hem the pants, and things like that. And he set up a business in Buxton, but that didn't do too well. So after, I guess, a year, he put his skills to do other things. right? Nobody gave him a handout, um, except that he did come into contact with a lot of business people who helped him, but he didn't repay them, right? So he became a wood seller. He used to leave Mahaika, cut the wood, and he used to sell it in Cane Grove. He developed interest in boats. His boats used to transport the wood. He bought a few boats, built those. He used to mind cattle, milk cows, as we call them, for milk. And eventually he worked his way. By the way, he was also a gold miner. There's a story about him that he used to deep dive to look for gold, but I don't think there's any evidence of that. That's just something that people make up. But long story short, he had a strong interest in his culture that guided his behavior. Um, so he eventually became wealthy again. Nobody gave him a handout. He worked his way up the ladder, and he became wealthy, and he became a person who knew how to wheel and deal. He became an entrepreneur, so to speak, right? A business person. Um, and in 1952, which is remarkable about Hari Prashad, was that um, he was so impressed with what was happening in India. And again, this is 1952. He took his entire family, his wife, Amla Devi, and at that time he had six kids. There are eight kids altogether, four boys and four girls. The oldest daughter was married to Justice Prem Prasad. So he went to India to live permanently with his kids and his wife. One of the things he said he place where he went um, was a place where his ancestors came from, right? There's a place where the three rivers meet, which we call the Trivedi Sangam. Sangam mean connection, right? The river Jamuna, Saraswati, and the Ganges. That's where a historic site. I do have a picture of that because um, uh, Rishi Prasad, who's Harry's grandson, who's now a member of the appellate court, lent me that picture to use, where they were taking a bath in that historic place, and that's the place where, um, and he did mention this, Sri Ram, Sita, and Lakshman would actually bathe in that same location when they were exiled. So again, my point is a very strong cultural background. He was a very hardworking person, very honest, and he used his wealth. Even when he was building his own house, people would approach him and say, "Can I use your house to have my daughter is getting married? Can I use your house?" Right? He was always giving people corrugated zinc sheets and sand and bricks and so on, and lending them wood to build schools. So aside from Prashad Nagar, there was a lot of schools that he built, and they were called Prashad Hindi schools. And this was even after he had built Prashad Nagar. So my point is, there's that entrepreneurial skill. It's a remarkable story of an individual. Now, I'm not saying he's the only one. We've got the Kisuns and Yusuf Prasad, who I've dedicated this study to. You've got the Shahs and so on, the Gafurs, who are very, entrepreneurial. But Harry's legacy, if you were to travel around Georgetown, I don't want to say there aren't many. There's some. The Dharamshala obviously stands out. We have the replica, the bronze replica of the SS Whitby, which the Indian government donated to us in Guyana in 1988. But Prashad Nagar stands out because, as Narayan said, one of the things that make that, I mean, there's a couple of things that's unique, and we can talk about that. One of the things that he was very firm on, and this is a time in the 50s when people were not so much, in a sense, uh, I don't want to use the word chauvinistic, but they were not too concerned about expressing themselves in terms of culturally who they are. But Harry was so culturally imbued with what he believed in. He said, "Look, I am going to name all the streets in Prashad Nagar. I'm going to call it an Indian name, and I'm going to name all the streets after, um, Hindu folks, people in my family, people who are connected with Indian culture. There's a street called Chedi Street. He's named two of them to show his love for his wife, Amla Devi.
Yes.
He had plans to build a Nehru and a Gandhi, park. Um, so he was very, very frontal, and that's one of the admirable qualities, and it's something but I think is important because especially if Guyana is going to be the Dubai of the Caribbean, modernization always tend to leave our history behind. So it's important that we recognize these landmarks, right? And I think that in a nutshell, again, I don't want to create a monologue, but that's in a nutshell, I believe, who Hari represented. Building Prashad Nagar that's a different story, as I said. So there's really two stories here in one.
Oh, that's an amazing story, Dr. Ramharack. Um, I would like to take the discussion a little higher in terms of the transformative roles of villages in Guyana's economy. We of course we have Prashad Nagar. It's seen as an upscale neighborhood, but we have other villages. I mentioned Triumph. You mentioned that in your script. There are other villages that we see popping up: Providence, Torkine, behind there. Um, but the traditional roles of villages was as religious and cultural centers as well. It was a place where skills were developed, like carpentry, furniture making. You had car repair shops, which is now big in places like Pakistan. From those humble places, you have important extensions in industrialization. We have barbers, tailors. My own parents were tailors. Uh, Business and commercial schools in the villages, and dress designing, tailoring, and so forth. Um, how can you elaborate some more on that? And also, how do you see the villages versus cities as growth and development centers?
Well,
Perhaps you could.
y- well, we don't have what they call rank size cities, right? We are like in the United States, you have many cities. We have what is called a primate city, which is one dominant city, like places like Guatemala City and Mexico City and so on. So that becomes like a sort of magnet for everything, right? So everything is being directed from there, right? The policies are being made, decisions are being made, the government is based in those big cities. So essentially you have most of the amenities that are found in these cities, but in the rural area, again, Guyana is kind of divided geographically. You're looking at different sections. You've got islands and so on, three different parts. You've got a large section that with resources, but it's not developed. I'm talking about the tropical rainforest. So villages were really the places where people could develop those skills, and they could use those skills to become small entrepreneurs, to kind of, in a sense, create sort of a cottage industries. But we are a farming community, so a lot of people in the villages engage in things like rice cultivation. They were connected to the sugar plantation. Fishing was also a way, and a lot of, I can tell you from my own experience, a lot of Indians who live, or a lot of people who live outside of the city, they would have something common around their house, which is the traditional garden, right? In my family, my mother was the one who would take care of the garden and make sure you could sell some of those things. You raise the chickens and the fowls and whatever. So those were the things, the traditional kind of things that people were engaged in. And I would say Guyana began to progress in the 1900s. So you see people from the countryside also begin to move into the city, right, to set up businesses. And those handful of businesses became symbolic of Indian achievement. So by the early 1900s, you see that sort of a developing middle class, right, emerging. By the time we get to the 1960s and so on, you see more of those industries developing. But country folks always were always being attracted, to what's happening in the city. But in terms of where Indians live, most of them obviously are in the countryside. But Georgetown has emerged as as I said, a magnet. Where it's going to develop as a much bigger magnet, because that's where everything is taking place. So historically, some of those skills that we had while living outside of the city, or skills that were used to keep us going, right? The traditional farming and so on. Things are changing now with technology, infusion of all kinds of technology that is gearing our economy in a different direction. Um, but if you're going back to the 60s and 50s, in those days, if you had a skill and if you're a smart business person, you could make that skill work. Because I guess the challenges were not as competitive as it is today. But still, that connection is always there. But if you are looking for a better education, to learn about entrepreneurial skills, you had to go to the cities, right? Primarily Georgetown in the old days.
Dr. Prasad, would you like to elaborate
Yeah,
along those
the
lines?
the one thing that you mentioned, Dr. Ganga, is the transformation of Guyana. And one of the points that you touched on, Dr. Ramarak, is the capitalization of indigenous knowledge within villages, because that's what it was. That was a form of survival,
Hmm.
whereby if you look at Amartya Sen and even Banerjee, both Nobel laureates in economics, they mentioned that these third world countries must be able to capitalize on the indigenous knowledge of the people to facilitate the transformation. Because while we are all looking externally for the adaptation of material well-being, that alone does not contribute to the transformation within villages or within village communities. So we have to bridge the two. And as you mentioned, Guyana is monopolized by Georgetown. That is why in one of my articles to the Kaichur News, I called for the government to develop satellite cities within regions so that services are available to people within those localities, and not to be able to lose income just to travel to Georgetown, just to affiliate themselves with someone through references that can help them. That you have to bring the services in the transformation. The government has to bring the services to the people so that they can see the benefits of that. What are your comments on such an initiative?
No, and I agree with that. That's the way to go, right? Because we are, things are very different, let's say, from the last 5 years to what we know Guyana to be, right? We're living in an emerging, I wouldn't say we're a petro state yet, but we're an emerging petro state. So I think a lot of those villages are going to be, transformational. You're going to see the kind of skills that people have are going to be changing. You're going to see the reliance on traditional agriculture is going to change. Right now there's a push for technology. Um, if you travel from, if you are traveling from one end of Barbados to the other end, you can't miss the fact that this is throughout Guyana. There's so much development in infrastructural development that is taking place. So it's not just the rural, urban connection that's there. Um, Rural folks have also, different needs. They also have different skills which they can put to use, different resources that is available where they are. I can tell you, for instance, the people are on the other end, East Berbice, uh, the extension of a bridge connecting, let's say, Suriname and Guyana, that's going to create, you're going to have a different kind of business emerging. You're going to have people who will be engaging in extensive trade between the two countries. You see a lot of hotels being built. Um, uh, ecotourism and things of that sort are going to be important in those areas. So the traditional village lifestyle, obviously, I think we all agree on that, is going to be transformational, and we see a lot of that taking place now. Um, that kind of transformation is going to take some time to reach out, obviously, to the interior and further places outside of our traditional residential area. Um, the needs of the communities that live in the interior, for instance, may be different, right? So there has to be different kind of development that has to be geared towards those areas. And I think you're seeing a lot of that taking place with the kind of infrastructural development. But obviously, there's going to be some growing pains. We're not a country, for instance, where we have a sort of a core set of people with skills, right? So it's going to take some time to train. We have an issue with nurses right now, so we don't have that number of people in our population. We're a rapidly developing country, but a very small population. So that labor is going to come from outside. It's going to have to come from someplace, right? So all of those things you're going to see happening. Um, I haven't seen any data on this, but I understand that there are people who have left are also coming back, whether they move into the country area or the outskirts of Georgetown. They're setting up business, things like fish farms and so on, applying technology to these kinds of things because the land is available out there, right? That's where you can do it. So a lot of those things are transformational and changing. Um, so if Harry was alive today, he would have been bewildered to see the kind of changes that are taking place today in Guyana. Um, and a lot of that is going to come, but as I said, we have some challenges. We have some people who are telling us that we're going to be sinking 2030 further, because these waves are rising up. So hopefully um, those are issues that has to be, I guess, aggressively addressed to protect people, whether they live in the country or in other parts of Guyana. So those are challenges, but
Yes.
it's a
Uh, I have, I have Dr. Ganga, I have a follow up.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Um, one one of the one of the issues that seem to arise regularly is the question of traditional values or cultural values and accommodation to modernity, modernization. You have studied people um, like Hari Prashad and like Singh, and you realize that it was their culture that facilitated their perception of progressive linkages with future linkages. So I don't see culture as an inhibition or as an inhibiting factor to the adaptation to modernization. Yet, and I have heard, I've seen writings of people close to the president and the vice president who argue on the opposite side and say culture inhibits some of the progress that needs to be made. Now, I think that is incorrect because if you go back to the time of W. Rostow, we're talking about the, the death of traditional society, the passing of traditional societies, and yet it is tradition to a very large degree that facilitated the development of many societies today. What are your thoughts on that?
well, we have to keep in mind that culture, the way we define culture is also transformational, right? but I see culture as a separate entity. When we talk about identity, I want to separate that from this whole notion of being a citizen. Now, you mentioned Rastao, the stages of economic development. Excuse me. Now, Rasta only looked at a handful of countries, and he looked at Western countries. But you know, the time that he was looking at these Western countries, these countries were already established, right? Most of them as economic giants. So that means the Europeans had already and the Americans had already settled their differences, their cultural differences. I mean, Europe broke up into several countries. You know, they already settled their border issues and cultural issues and so on. They had religious wars, so they were on the way to economic development. So Rostow could easily say, well, hey, you know, if we look at these Western European countries and America, everybody can adopt the same strategies. But the problem with us, third world countries, is that when the plane is taken off, the different stages of economic development, sometimes the plane crash because some countries don't even have the resources, right, for economic development as the Europeans had. So that would be one example of a problem with that model. But where I stand on this whole notion of economic, it is one variable, and I think culture, as I said, is transformational, but culture can also be a motivating factor. And if we're talking about Hari Prashad, I mean, he made that very clear in his own narrative, that culture was influential in what he did because he saw the goodness in people and he wanted to help because that's what his, you know, cultural and religious values and so on taught him to do. Um, so there are other factors I think that's going to, you know, have an influence on how culture can influence who we are. I think there's a lot of young people today who may not necessarily manifest that same affinity, strong affinity for culture that some people may have had, like Harry. We're talking about him, um, but there may be other factors, like for instance, the motivational factor. You know, for wealth would be something that I wish that all Guyanese, right? People will say, well, uh, Indians have that, um, have that urge, that motivation, or that's something akin to Asian. I wish all Guyanese can see that and adapt that part um, of the culture to be wealthy because there's enough for everybody here. Otherwise, you're going to have, some differences, and you may have some clashes and whatever. Um, but but I think there's a lot also that government can do to create a. If the culture is not necessarily based on tradition, you can create cultural values that steer you in a certain direction. I don't mean forcing people, but you can create conditions, right, that allow people to say, look, well, if wealth seeking is something that is important, part of our Guyanese culture, then these are the opportunities here, so you make sure that you adapt that. You can have classes, you can have training sessions and so on that allows people, as you see happening now, right, to adopt those different cultural values. Now, people may be losing every generation. They tell us we lose some of our cultural religious connection with the with our ancestors, but the point is that's something that's natural, it's traditional. But there are also forces that operate around us. I can tell you now, for instance, India, has its eye out looking at people who are in the diaspora for the first time. So there's cultural exchanges that are taking place. There were cultural exchanges before, but those elements are also very important to keep us, within that same framework of how culture can influence in a certain direction. And again, for people who are listening, I know this sounds like I'm addressing an Indian concern, but I don't mean to exclude other people. This is just, what my focus has been, to kind of try to document Indian history to understand our history, right? So I'm using the examples from my own and our own experiences. So I hope people understand that it's not, necessarily that I'm saying that other people, are not on the same wavelength. I'm just using the examples that I know I'm more aware of.
That's a very good point there. There's a rejoinder to the cultural aspects of our development. We could say on the road to great wealth, we must have high cultural values. Culture has served us very well. As you can recall, currently we have the religious schools, the Catholic school system. We have the Saraswati school system, and those on the Mahika areas, I can't recall the name, but Govind Brahmachari schools. Those are there. We have Anglican schools. We had the religious schools. They served us well, and we should not just abandon them. They have a role to help us shape our values in terms of wealth acquisition and how we deploy those wealth, as Hari Prashad has exemplified in his own ways, in various ways. So we need to keep some of those attributes in our society. The other point that Professor Prasad mentioned was the satellites or the growth poles and the regional locations. In the past, our hub for skills development was the sugar estates. All skills were developed there, all different types of skills. And then spun off from around that in the villages, you had related skills that were essential to women, girls, as they go through the life cycle. So we need to take that approach in looking at the transformational role of our new structures, villages like you're pointing out there. This is a very, very important lesson for all of us. So I'd just like to add that comment there. Um,
And just if I can add, Hari Prashad's, life is also, it's a cultural example of some things he can achieve if you put your mind to it. And I think that can apply to everyone, right? That, if you're determined to build something, you can get it done. And he had many people who he tapped into for assistance, who helped him, but he had a vision. So if people can have those visions and have that drive, I mean, that's all part of our cultural elements, right? So you can do the same thing, and then the opportunities are there, I think.
uh, Professor Prasad, you want to add some
Yeah,
comments there?
yeah, yes. The see sometimes uh, if we can capture, like you mentioned, and we keep talking about Hari Prasad, and I keep thinking about the local rice millers. Most of the rice mills, the majority of the rice mills were owned by Indians. Now, what it is within that context that enabled these people to have that foresight and see that they can, while they are accumulating wealth themselves, they are also distributing well-being to the community. Similarly, most of the gas stations when I was a kid growing up were owned by Indians along the roads. And so the entrepreneurial spirit was there. What we have not done very well is to chronicle the impetus that gave rise to that entrepreneurial spirit so that we can now in return capitalize on it. I don't know whether you agree or disagree, but the point is what I'm saying and what uh, Dr. Ganga just mentioned is that the estate system was able to capitalize on that. And because they were present and they were able to see that and they cultivated. Do you think it is possible for the Guyana government to do the same?
Well, I don't know if you can do that with the estate system because obviously sugar is changing, right? The
Yes.
economy is changing. But one of the things you mentioned, which I think you can't really change that, and that's something you have to have. I watch my father, work. He would get up early in the morning and go, and with his cutlass on his back and his lunchbox and so on, and he would get on the lorry and work. And I watched him as a young kid. I saw him build a cottage for us, right? We moved out from an area, we built a cottage, and then 5 years down the road, he had a couple of kids, and then he built a bigger house, right? And then he bought some rice field, and then he bought some land, and so my point is, I think all of those examples that you give were because we were not, in a sense, and I hope this come out the right way. um, we had what we call delayed gratification, right? You invest, you
Yes.
take, and then you take that and you invest. That's what we did with land. They did the same thing in Suriname, same thing in Trinidad, Guyana. We bought the land, a piece of land, then you do like Harry, you buy a bunch of milk cows, then you bought a rice mill, and over time, as your family increase, you increase the wealth that you have. But that whole cultural element of delayed gratification is very, very important. And I think that's one thing, my father taught all of his kids. We were a big family. And I think if all of us can have that kind of a thinking, um, then I think it will reinvest in our own value and what we have, right? And like I said, the resources are there. We have more of a bountiful resources now. There's opportunities for everybody for all kinds of business. I mean, you look at the Chronicle, you turn the page and you see all these bids for all kinds of things. And I'm wondering why these people, why are some people still complaining that you don't have the opportunities? But it's like almost every page there's something that's being advertised for a bid or whatever. So, so we have that something, we're blessed in that sense to have that. It's just a matter of, coming up with the idea and putting your mind to work. And um, even if you have land, if land is given to folks, they will find a way to make use of that land. I don't think young people want to go into, you know, um, to create the biari and plant rice and cut cane. We're moving away from that. So, but if you provide opportunities for people, and Guyanese are very innovative. Look at where they are. We have more Guyanese living outside of Guyana. And if you tap into that diaspora resources, you'd be surprised of the level of education. I'm out here in Texas right now. I dropped my daughter off to the hospital, and almost every single people who are running the hospital are actually Guyanese, right? Who have reached a level that we could never imagine, but they were given the opportunities because some of us were forced to leave. But the point is, you're here, the opportunities are here, and you make use of it, and you can make things for yourself. So the naysayers and the complainers, it's hard for me to understand, when they're writing in the newspaper in Guyana, where exactly is that coming from? Because things are different.
Yeah. So the idea of values has two dimensions: the cultural dimension and also the economic dimension. So you have economic value added. So a lots of entrepreneurial opportunities can emanate from economic value added. If you're looking at, let's take the hospital, there are entrepreneurial opportunities there to be a supplier. So you can do intrapreneurship, INTRA. By becoming a supplier, you can supply gloves, you can supply garments, clothes, suits, and so forth. So those are valuable areas where you can add value added and develop around those areas. Now, from our own family history, it's kind of similar, but on a smaller scale to Hari Prashad, because my father was a wood seller. He didn't cut the wood, but he bought the wood, and the launch. One of Hari Prasad's launch was named Kamla Devi. I know that launch. It was at the wood coker. So the idea of looking at activities in the village and what's needed, what people need. Hari Prashad did that, and that's how he got engaged in different things. And so he was able to build upon that. So to our listeners out there who are thinking entrepreneurially, they can also look at a business, they can look at land development, and in that regard, I would have a question on land development. Whether you think that our sugar estate lands should be part of our inheritance, which should go to uh, the children and descendants of the indentured laborers and the ex-slave related workers on those plantations.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, land is important, right? Land is becoming expensive in Guyana. Um, uh, it was actually land that Harry bought from Booker's, right? It was called Area H. It was really a mud land. It was all, it was a rice field, and he developed that. So again, it shows you the ingenuity of people when they have some kind of resources. They can add value to it, and make it into something else. Yes, I believe, this is my opinion on this. I think um, you can't keep pumping money into the sugar industry. I think that's gone. That, it served our purpose in the old days, and I think we need to move away from that, because this economy is changing. And if Karl Marx says, land to the tiller. If you can give folks land, because they have worked on the land. Here in Texas, if somebody's not in the house, and a squatter comes in and they decide to live there for a couple of years and taking care of the house can eventually go to them. So if somebody is working on the land and making good use of the land, which we've seen in places like Blackbush and so on, when we had those projects to develop those land, then yes, I am absolutely in agreement that the land should go to people who can make use of it, and especially people who are connected to the land. Now, you can't take city folks, like the like Mao Zedong, and from the city, and put them on the farm to work. It's not going to work like that. So you keep the Georgetown folks there, but the folks in the countryside, let them, since they're accustomed to the land, they know the land, they know how to work the land, they're familiar with that environment. Yes, absolutely, that is something that we can consider doing.
Dr. Prasad, would you like some
Yeah,
closing remarks?
yeah. One of the problems, or one of the dilemma confronting the Guyanese government is how do you create some cooperative incentives between Afro and Indo Guyanese, because the country cannot develop unilaterally with any one of the ethnic groups. You have to have forms of cooperation and cooperative ventures. And that has always been very challenging because historically, the, the suspicion, the rivalry, and the kind of protectionism that that are present within the society is a huge problem. However, I feel that if you start out on a small scale, so that the small scales of cooperativism can be very visible, so that people can see, both Afro and Indo Guyanese can see the benefits to be derived from such venture, rather than trying to transform, the entire country at the same time. Sometimes, as Schumacher has pointed out in his book Small is Beautiful, you can start out on a small scale, and you can create from that small scale, a, you know, great mobilizing kind of initiatives that can then proliferate throughout the country. And I don't know how much of that is going on. Um, do you know if such ventures are in place or underway?
Well, we know, Barnum tried to do that, uh, when he was in power, to try to give people land. I believe it was called Zambia in that area, but that didn't work. So my point is, you have to. I mean, we're talking about a broader issue here, right? We're talking about the ethnic conflict that which we have spent a lot of time addressing and talking about it and so on. Um, but I do have to say that from my own observation, I think some of that is transforming. I think younger folks today are much more connected with reality. They want to leave that baggage behind. That's my sense of where this is going. And I do think that the PPP will have will make some more inroads when it comes to that issue. But yes, it may not necessarily have to be with land, but I think where you can promote, right, those kind of cooperative ventures, whether it's an affirmative action, whether people are complaining, well, we don't have a lot of money going to business. Well, okay, then the government can help you create a business so you can access funds, right? So maybe a program not just for Africans or poor Indians, but it can also go to Amerindians. And we haven't even talked about the Amerindians,
Yeah,
right? So projects like that would be would in a sense be
yes.
important, right?
Yeah, I think we would have a second session with Dr. Ramharack to continue this dialogue. Right now, we will turn over to our host, Ms. Shamisa Ali, to see if there are any questions and concerns.
Thank you, Dr. Ganga. We don't have any questions, but all in all, I know our viewers are enjoying this topic and we need more of it on this program. And you're absolutely right. We would love to have Dr. Ramharak back. Dr. Ramharak, we will now ask for your closing remarks.
Well, I do want to thank yourself, Shamiza, and Dr. Ganga, and my first interaction here with Professor Narayan Prasad. I do appreciate, and I think a program like this that explores opportunities and talks about creating solution and looking forward to what we can do is important. We're not a people that have always been engaged in discussion. We're kind of short when it comes to engaging people, and I think that's an important cultural element of who we are. And I think that has to continue. The name of your show includes the word dialogue, and I think that says a lot. So continue with what you're doing. Um, and obviously it is important for us to be doing this. So that's my final word on that. I'm sure we can continue with this discussion at some point.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Ramharack and Ms. Shamisa.
Thank you to our entire panel and to our moderator. Thank you to all of our viewers for being here, sharing their feedback. We appreciate you. And until next time, I'm your hostess, Shamiza Ali, and this is the Guyana Dialogue. Good night, everyone.
Are we off?
Thank
Good
Dr.
you.
night.
Ganga, are we off? Are we off camera?